Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Morrison and I am 27 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 14 months. This happened during the fall of 2003, when the missing person case of Celeste Vaughn turned into something that still haunts me. I was still new to the job, still eager to prove myself worthy of the badge and the trust that came with it. Every call felt like a test, every decision a chance to either validate my training or expose my inexperience. I'd graduated top of my class at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, memorized every protocol, studied every manual until the pages were dog-eared and coffee-stained. But 14 months in, I was beginning to understand that textbooks couldn't prepare you for the reality of human behavior in crisis, or the way fear could make even rational people do impossible things. The call came in at 4:47 p.m. on October 15th, just as the autumn darkness was beginning to settle over the Hoh River Valley like a heavy blanket. Dispatch crackled through my radio as I was finishing my afternoon patrol near the visitor center. Unit 23, we have a missing person report. Female, 34 years old. Last seen yesterday evening near the Elk Lakes Trail. Family called it in an hour ago. I keyed the mic, trying to keep the anticipation out of my voice. This was exactly the kind of case I needed to handle well. Unit 23 copy. What's the timeline? Missing person is Celeste Vaughn, wildlife photographer from Seattle, was documenting elk migration patterns. Last radio contact with her assistant was yesterday at 1800 hours. Vehicle still at trailhead, tent and equipment missing. A photographer working alone in the backcountry wasn't unusual, especially during elk season, but something about the timing bothered me. Any indication of her planned route? Negative. Assistant says she was tracking a large bull elk, following migration patterns up toward the high meadows. Weather's been clear, no storm systems. I pulled out my park map, spreading it across the hood of my patrol vehicle. The Elk Lakes Trail was a moderate day hike, but it connected to a network of backcountry routes that could take an experienced hiker deep into the wilderness. If Celeste had followed elk sign-off trail, she could be anywhere within a 20-square-mile area. I'm en route to the trailhead, ETA 15 minutes. The drive up the winding Forest Service road gave me time to run through the protocols. Standard missing person procedure: secure the last known position, interview witnesses, establish search parameters, contact regional SAR coordinator if the search extended beyond initial response capability. I'd done this twice before. Both times the missing persons had been found within hours, embarrassed but unharmed. But as I pulled into the nearly empty trailhead parking lot, something felt different. Celeste's red Honda Civic sat alone under the towering Douglas firs, autumn leaves scattered across its windshield like nature's calling cards. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the ever-present sound of wind through the canopy seemed muted. I conducted a preliminary vehicle search, noting that Celeste had indeed taken her camping gear. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Derek who'd driven up from Seattle, provided what details he could. She's been working on this elk migration project for 3 years, Derek explained, his breath visible in the cooling air. Really experienced, you know? She's spent weeks alone in the backcountry, said she'd found sign of a huge bull, something special, wanted to document its movement patterns. When was your last contact? Yesterday around 6. She radioed that she was setting up camp near what she called the Ancient Grove. Said I'd know what she meant when I saw her photos. That was it. Ancient Grove. I knew several areas that could fit that description, all of them requiring off-trail hiking through increasingly difficult terrain. Did she give any indication of her planned return? She said 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather held. Derek's eyes were red-rimmed with worry and exhaustion. Look, Celeste doesn't just disappear. Something's wrong. I spent the remaining daylight conducting a preliminary search of the main trail, finding Celeste's boot prints clearly visible in the muddy sections for the first 2 miles. Then about halfway to Elk Lakes, the prints veered off trail to the northwest. following what appeared to be game trails through increasingly dense forest. By the time I returned to the trailhead, full darkness had settled over the valley. I made the decision to return at first light with proper search equipment and potentially additional personnel. Derek insisted on staying at a nearby campground, desperate to help in any way he could. That night I lay awake in my small ranger quarters, studying topographical maps and trying to predict where an experienced photographer might go to document elk behavior. The Olympic backcountry was vast and unforgiving, full of deep ravines, dense undergrowth, and hidden valleys where someone could disappear for weeks without being found. I arrived at the trailhead at dawn, equipped with a full pack, GPS unit, and emergency communication gear. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wet earth and decomposing leaves. I'd requested backup from the regional SAR coordinator, but the earliest they could deploy a team was late afternoon. Following Celeste's trail off the main path required careful attention. Her boot prints were clear in the soft earth, accompanied by the deeper impressions of her heavy camera equipment. But as I tracked her route deeper into the wilderness, I began to notice things that didn't quite fit the pattern of a photographer following wildlife. Her path seemed almost too deliberate, following ridge lines and avoiding obvious campsites in favor of more difficult terrain. After 3 hours of careful tracking, I found her first campsite in a small clearing surrounded by massive old-growth cedars, the ancient grove Derek had mentioned. The site was pristine, almost surgically clean. Her tent had been pitched with military precision, fire ring constructed with perfect efficiency. But Celeste's gear was gone, and there were no signs of struggle or hasty departure, just a few scattered ashes from her cooking fire and boot prints leading further northwest, deeper into the roadless wilderness. I keyed my radio to report the discovery, but received only static in response. Not unusual in the heavy forest, but it added to my growing sense of unease. I marked the GPS coordinates and continued following the trail. For the next 2 hours, Celeste's tracks led me through increasingly difficult terrain. The trail wound through dense undergrowth, across steep ravines, and around massive fallen trees that blocked the path like nature's barricades. But the route never seemed random. It followed natural corridors with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where they were going. It was just after noon when I found the second campsite, and that's when everything changed. This camp was different. The fire ring was larger, constructed with flat stones that had clearly been gathered from considerable distances. The tent site had been cleared and leveled with tools, not just camping equipment, and scattered around the perimeter were small piles of stones arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. But what made my blood run cold was the tree. 20 feet from the campsite, carved deep into the bark of a massive cedar, was a message. She came willingly. The letters were precise, carved with a sharp blade, and the sap bleeding from the wounds looked fresh. I approached the tree slowly, every instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. Beneath the carved message, scattered at the base of the tree, were pieces of camera equipment, lens caps, film canisters, and fragments of what had once been an expensive telephoto lens. But no camera, no film, and most importantly, no sign of Celeste herself. I tried the radio again, moving to higher ground to get better reception. Still nothing but static and the occasional burst of interference that sounded almost like whispered voices. My GPS unit showed my exact coordinates, but when I tried to activate the emergency beacon function, the device simply displayed an error message. That's when I realized I was being watched. The feeling started as a subtle awareness, the kind of primitive instinct that had kept humans alive for millennia. The forest was too quiet, the silence too complete. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving the towering trees motionless against the gray October sky. I slowly drew my service weapon, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. My training kicked in. Establish defensive position, identify threats, maintain communication. But out here, alone in the wilderness with failing equipment, those protocols felt inadequate against whatever intelligence had staged this scene. "This is Ranger Morrison," I called out, my voice carrying clearly in the still air. "If someone is out there, I need you to identify yourself immediately." The response came not as a voice, but as a sound I recognized from my wildlife training. The mating call of a bull elk, perfect in its pitch and rhythm. but it came from the wrong direction, from a cluster of trees where no elk could possibly be standing. I moved cautiously toward the sound, weapon drawn, every sense hyper-alert. The call came again, this time from behind me, then again from my left flank. Someone was moving through the forest with the stealth and intelligence of a predator, someone who knew these woods intimately and understood exactly how to use them as weapons. As I backed toward the clearing, trying to keep the tree line in sight from all directions, I stepped on something that crunched under my boot. Looking down, I saw scattered pieces of what had once been a Park Service radio, the same model I carried on my belt. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random. Someone had been watching Park Service operations, learning our equipment, our procedures, our responses to missing person calls, and now they were using that knowledge against me. I ran, not away from the threat, my training and pride wouldn't allow that, but toward higher ground where my radio might function, and I could establish a defensive position with clear sightlines. But as I climbed the steep slope above the campsite, following what appeared to be a game trail, I began to understand that even my retreat was being orchestrated. The path was too clear, too convenient. Branches that should have blocked the way had been recently broken. Stones that would have turned an ankle had been moved aside. Someone wanted me to go this direction, wanted me to reach whatever destination lay ahead, but I had no choice. Behind me, I could hear the subtle sounds of pursuit, not the clumsy crashing of a frightened animal, but the careful, measured movement of something that hunted with intelligence and patience. The trail led to a rocky outcropping that provided an excellent view of the valley below and clear radio reception. As I crested the ridge, my radio suddenly crackled to life. "Unit 23, this is dispatch. What's your status?" I keyed the mic with shaking hands. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23. I have a Code 10 situation at the Celeste Vaughn missing person site, requesting immediate backup and SR deployment." "Unit 23, you're breaking up. Repeat your message." I tried again, but the radio dissolved into static. When it cleared, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice reporting that I had found Celeste Vaughn safe and that no further assistance was required. Someone was monitoring Park Service frequencies. Someone with access to recording equipment and the technical knowledge to intercept and replay radio transmissions. The fake message would buy them time, delay any rescue response, leave me completely isolated. As the implications sank in, I heard a sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Slow, deliberate applause echoing from the forest below. "Very good, Ranger Morrison." The voice carried clearly in the still air, rich with amusement and something darker. "You're learning faster than most." I pressed myself against the rocks, trying to locate the source of the voice while scanning for escape routes. The speaker was invisible, hidden somewhere in the dense canopy below, but his words reached me with perfect clarity. "You want to know about Celeste, don't you? About what happened to the pretty photographer who came looking for elk?" "Show yourself," I shouted back, my voice cracking with tension. Laughter drifted up from the forest. "Oh, I don't think so. Not yet. You see, Ranger Morrison, this is much more interesting. You're so young, so eager to prove yourself, so predictable." The voice seemed to move as he spoke, first from directly below, then from my left, then from somewhere behind me. He was using the acoustics of the valley to disguise his position, demonstrating a knowledge of these woods that went far beyond casual familiarity. "Who are you?" I demanded. "Someone who knows these mountains better than you ever will. Someone who understands that the most dangerous predator in any wilderness isn't the bear or the cougar. It's the human being who decides to hunt." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "What did you do to Celeste?" "She's alive. For now. But her situation is precarious. Much like yours, actually." I tried to think through my options with the rational mind of a trained law enforcement officer, but panic was beginning to cloud my judgment. My radio was compromised, my GPS was malfunctioning, and I was facing an adversary who had clearly been planning this confrontation for some time. "What do you want?" "Entertainment, Ranger Morrison. You see, Celeste was disappointing, too passive, too willing to accept her situation. But you're different. You're going to fight. You're going to run. You're going to make this interesting. The voice paused, and in the silence I could hear something that made my stomach lurch. A woman's distant scream, cut short as if muffled by a hand or gag. That was Celeste, in case you were wondering. She's about 3 miles northeast of your current position in a place where the elk come to die. Find her, Ranger Morrison. Save her. But remember, I know these woods, and I know you. Every move you make, every decision you consider, I've already anticipated. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no wind, no sound of movement from below. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I stayed on the ridge for another 10 minutes, scanning the forest below for any sign of movement. But whoever was down there had vanished with the same supernatural silence he'd used to approach. Only the echo of Celeste's scream remained, burning in my memory like a brand. Northeast. 3 miles. Where the elk come to die. I knew that phrase. During my orientation training, an old-timer had mentioned a remote valley where elk went when they were sick or injured, a place so isolated that their bones accumulated over generations. It was supposed to be a myth, a local legend, but the description had stayed with me. A hidden meadow surrounded by cliffs, accessible only through a narrow canyon that flooded every spring. If Celeste was there, she was in a natural prison with only one entrance, and I was walking directly into a trap. But what choice did I have? I was a park ranger. Protecting people was literally my job, the reason I'd taken the oath and pinned on the badge. Even if it meant facing an enemy who held every advantage, I couldn't abandon Celeste to whatever fate awaited her. I began the descent from the ridge, moving as quietly as possible while maintaining a pace that would get me to the valley before nightfall. But as I navigated the steep terrain, I began to notice signs that my every movement was being observed. Broken branches marked my passage, but they were broken in ways that formed arrows, pointing toward the route I was supposed to take. Stones had been arranged to block alternate paths, funneling me toward the narrow canyon that led to the elk graveyard. Even my attempted stealth was being anticipated and directed. The forest around me remained unnaturally silent, as if every living creature had fled the area. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed to have disappeared. It was like walking through a museum diorama, beautiful but completely lifeless. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself moving through increasingly difficult terrain. The game trails I'd been following narrowed and disappeared, forcing me to push through dense undergrowth that caught at my uniform and equipment. Thorns tore at my hands and face, and more than once I had to use my knife to cut through barriers of fallen branches. But the obstacles never seemed random. They slowed my progress without stopping it completely, creating noise and leaving clear evidence of my passage. I was being herded like livestock, driven toward a destination I couldn't see but couldn't avoid. The sun was low on the horizon when I finally reached the entrance to the canyon. It was exactly as described in the old stories. A narrow gap between towering rock walls, barely wide enough for a single person to pass through. The sound of running water echoed from within, and the air carried scents that didn't belong in a healthy forest. Decay, stagnation, and something else that made my nostrils flare in instinctive revulsion. I paused at the entrance, knowing that once I entered the canyon, retreat would be nearly impossible. The walls were too steep to climb, and the narrow passage would become a killing ground if my pursuer chose to trap me inside. But somewhere beyond those stone walls, Celeste was waiting. And despite every rational instinct screaming at me to turn back, to wait for backup that might never come, I couldn't abandon her. I entered the canyon. The passage was longer than I'd expected, winding between walls of wet stone that rose nearly 100 feet on either side. My footsteps echoed strangely in the enclosed space, and the sound of running water grew steadily louder. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of decomposition, as if I was walking through the throat of some massive dying creature. After what felt like an eternity, the canyon opened into a circular meadow perhaps 200 yards across, surrounded by sheer cliffs that made escape impossible except through the passage I'd just navigated. And in the center of the meadow, scattered across the ground like macabre decorations, were the bones of hundreds of elk. They lay in various stages of decay, From recent casualties still covered in hide and sinew to ancient skeletons bleached white by decades of weather. The newest remains were concentrated near a small stream that trickled down from somewhere high above, and among them, partially hidden by the curve of massive ribs, I saw a splash of bright color that didn't belong in the natural palette of death and decay. Celeste's red jacket. I approached carefully, weapon drawn, scanning the cliff tops for any sign of movement. But the meadow felt empty, abandoned, as if even the predator who'd led me here had withdrawn to let me discover the truth alone. Celeste was alive, but barely. She'd been tied to a framework of elk bones, positioned so that she was forced to kneel among the scattered remains of dozens of animals. Her camera equipment lay scattered around her, pieces of expensive lenses and electronic components mixed with the ancient bones like some twisted art installation. But she wasn't alone. As I cut through the ropes binding her wrists, I saw the other bones, the ones that didn't belong to elk. Human bones scattered among the animal remains with casual indifference. Ribs and femurs and skulls, some obviously recent, others weathered by years of exposure. Celeste's eyes were wide with terror and exhaustion, but she was conscious enough to grab my arm with desperate strength as I freed her from the bonds. He's not human," she whispered, her voice raw from screaming. "He knows things, predicts everything. Every move I made, every place I tried to hide. He was already there waiting." I helped her to her feet, noting the deep rope burns around her wrists and ankles. She'd been here for more than 24 hours, but aside from dehydration and shock, she seemed physically unharmed. "Who is he?" I asked, supporting her weight as we began moving toward the canyon entrance. "Said his name was Ezra, used to be a ranger like you, but something happened to him out here, something that changed him." Her voice was barely audible. "He's been living in these woods for years, hunting people who come alone. The bones. God, the bones are all hikers, photographers, researchers, people who disappeared and were never found." Ezra. The name triggered a memory from my training files, something about a ranger who'd been dismissed from the service under suspicious circumstances. But before I could remember the details, Celeste grabbed my arm again, her grip tight enough to bruise. "He's coming back. He said he would. Said the real hunt begins when someone comes to save me." As if summoned by her words, a voice echoed from the canyon entrance behind us. "Leaving so soon, Ranger Morrison? But we haven't finished our conversation." I spun around, raising my weapon toward the sound. But the canyon entrance was empty, the voice seeming to come from the stone walls themselves. "You found her, good. I was beginning to think you weren't as capable as your training record suggested. But now comes the interesting part, getting her out alive." Celeste pressed against my side, trembling with terror. "He's everywhere," she whispered. "Knows every inch of this place, every hiding spot, every escape route. We can't—" Her words were cut off by the sound of something heavy falling into the canyon entrance. When I looked back, I saw that a massive boulder had somehow been dislodged from above, completely blocking our only exit. "Problem, Ranger Morrison?" The voice carried clear amusement. "Did your wilderness training cover rock climbing? Because that's about a 60-foot climb straight up wet stone, with an injured civilian to protect, in the dark." I looked up at the canyon walls, searching for any possible route to the top. The stone was slick with moisture and moss, nearly vertical, with no obvious handholds or ledges. Even with proper climbing equipment, it would be a difficult ascent. With Celeste in her current condition, it was impossible. "What do you want?" I called out. "I want to see what you're made of, Ranger Morrison. You see, most people, when they're truly trapped, show their real nature. The civilized mask falls away, and the animal underneath reveals itself." His voice seemed to move around the canyon walls, sometimes coming from above, sometimes from the stone itself. "Some people become cowards. They beg, they plead, they sacrifice others to save themselves. Others become heroes, noble and self-sacrificing right up until the moment they die. But a few, a precious few, become something else entirely. They become hunters." A rope ladder suddenly dropped from somewhere above, landing near the blocked entrance. It was clearly old, the rope frayed and stained with substances I preferred not to identify. One rope ladder, not strong enough for 2 people, but sufficient for 1. So you have a choice, Ranger Morrison. Save yourself and leave the pretty photographer to an unpleasant fate, or stay with her and discover what it feels like to be prey. Celeste looked at the ladder, then at me, her eyes reflecting the same terrible understanding. Someone could escape, but not both of us. Go, she whispered. Get help. Come back for me. I shook my head. Not happening. We're both getting out of here. But even as I said it, I was studying the canyon walls, looking for any alternative. The stone was weathered limestone, carved by centuries of spring floods. There had to be handholds, ledges, some way to climb without relying on the trap that had been so conveniently provided. Tick-tock, Ranger Morrison. Darkness is falling, and I get much more dangerous after sunset. This is my territory, my hunting ground. In the dark, I can see you, track you, predict your every move. But you'll be blind, stumbling, making noise that will guide me right to you. He was right. The last light was already fading from the sky above the canyon walls, and soon we'd be trapped in absolute darkness with a predator who knew every inch of the terrain. That's when I noticed something I'd missed in my initial survey of the canyon walls. Near the back of the meadow, almost hidden by shadows, was what looked like a darker patch of stone. Not a ledge or handhold, but possibly a cave or crevice large enough for a person to hide in. I helped Celeste move toward the back wall, trying to look casual as if we were simply exploring our prison. But as we got closer, I could see that my guess was correct. There was an opening in the stone, narrow but deep enough to provide concealment. Ah, you found my little secret. The voice was closer now, no longer echoing from the canyon walls but coming from somewhere nearby. Yes, there is a cave. Quite spacious, actually. I've made some improvements over the years. Added some comfortable furnishings. You'll find it quite educational. Despite the warning, I helped Celeste through the narrow opening. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, extending back into the cliff face for at least 30 feet. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to make out details that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, pinned to the stone with what looked like bone fragments sharpened into nails. Pictures of hikers, photographers, researchers, all the people whose bones now littered the meadow outside. And in every image, the subjects were clearly unaware they were being photographed, caught in moments of vulnerability and fear. But it was the newest additions that made me nearly vomit. Pictures of me taken over the past several hours. Me following Celeste's trail, me at the ridge, me entering the canyon. Every step of my journey had been documented with the clinical precision of a predator studying its prey. And pinned above all the others, like the centerpiece of some demented shrine, was a Park Service personnel photograph. A man in his 40s, wearing a ranger uniform, with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that spoke of trauma and psychological damage. Below the photograph was a nameplate. Ezra Blackwood, Park Ranger, 1987-2000. Recognize me, Ranger Morrison? The voice was right outside the cave now, close enough that I could hear breathing. Of course, I've changed quite a bit since that photo was taken. 13 years of wilderness living tends to alter a man's appearance. I positioned myself between Celeste and the cave entrance, weapon drawn and ready. But in the cramped space, with Celeste behind me and only one way out, I was trapped as effectively as any animal in a den. You're probably wondering what happened to me, what turned a dedicated park ranger into this. His voice was conversational now, almost friendly. It started with a missing person case just like yours. A little girl, 8 years old, separated from her family during a camping trip in the North Cascades. The breathing outside the cave grew heavier, more labored, as if the speaker was becoming agitated. I searched for 6 days, 6 days without sleep, without proper food, pushing myself beyond any reasonable limit. And I found her, Ranger Morrison. Found her in a place very much like this one. But I was too late. She'd been played with, tortured, used for entertainment by someone who saw her as nothing more than a toy. I could hear movement outside, the sound of someone pacing back and forth in front of the cave entrance. The thing is, I caught him. The man who killed that little girl. Tracked him down, cornered him, had him dead to rights. But when the arrest team arrived, when it came time to process him through the system, to rely on courts and lawyers and the civilized machinery of justice, the voice dropped to a whisper. He walked. Technicality. Improper search procedures. Celeste pressed against my back, and I could feel her trembling. Outside, the pacing had stopped. That's when I understood the truth, Ranger Morrison. The system we serve, the civilization we protect, it's not designed to stop real predators. It's designed to enable them, to give them rights and protections and second chances while their victims rot in the ground. A hand suddenly appeared at the cave entrance, pale and scarred, holding what looked like a crude knife made from sharpened bone. So I became something the system couldn't control. Something that hunts the hunters, that gives predators a taste of their own medicine. For 13 years, I've been cleaning up the wilderness, removing the human parasites that prey on innocent people. The hand withdrew, and I heard the sound of metal on stone. He was sharpening something. But you're different, Ranger Morrison. You're not a predator, not yet. You're just naive. Still believing in protocols and procedures, still thinking that following the rules will keep people safe. A low chuckle echoed from outside. Tonight you're going to learn the truth about human nature, about what happens when civilization falls away and only survival matters. Something rolled into the cave, a small metal canister that bounced off the stone walls before coming to rest near my feet. In the dim light filtering through the entrance, I could see it was leaking some kind of gas. Smoke grenade, Ezra's voice explained. Military issue. Won't kill you, but it will make breathing rather difficult. You have maybe 3 minutes before the cave becomes uninhabitable. Already my eyes were beginning to water, and Celeste had started coughing behind me. The gas was thick and acrid, burning my lungs and throat with each breath. Of course, you could always come outside. Face me directly, man to man. Give the girl a fighting chance while we settle this properly. I looked back at Celeste, seeing the panic in her eyes as the smoke continued to fill our shelter. She was already struggling to breathe, and I knew that in another minute or two she'd lose consciousness. There was no choice. I had to go out and face him. Stay here, I whispered to Celeste. No matter what you hear, don't come out until the air clears. She grabbed my arm, shaking her head, but I gently pulled free and moved toward the cave entrance. The smoke was so thick now that I could barely see, and each breath felt like inhaling razor blades. I emerged from the cave into the relative clarity of the canyon air, weapon raised, scanning for any sign of Ezra. The meadow was bathed in moonlight, turning the scattered elk bones into ghostly sculptures that cast long shadows across the ground. Very good, Ranger Morrison. I knew you wouldn't let the girl suffocate. The voice came from directly behind me. I spun around, but saw nothing except the cave entrance and the cliff wall. Over here. This time from my left. I turned again and caught a glimpse of movement among the bone piles, a flash of tattered clothing, a pale face that disappeared the instant I focused on it. You're fast, the voice observed. Good reflexes. But you're thinking like a civilized man following rules of engagement, worrying about due process and proper arrest procedures. Something whistled past my ear, a thrown bone that shattered against the cliff wall behind me. I'm not a criminal to be apprehended, Ranger Morrison. I'm a predator, and predators don't play by civilized rules. Another bone flew from a different direction, this one catching me in the shoulder hard enough to spin me around. As I struggled to regain my balance, I saw him, a scarecrow figure emerging from behind a massive elk skeleton, moving with the fluid grace of something that had spent years learning to hunt. Ezra Blackwood was barely recognizable as human. His hair was long and matted, his beard tangled with bits of bone and dried vegetation. His Park Service uniform had been modified over the years, patched with animal hides and decorated with what looked like human teeth strung together like primitive jewelry. But his eyes were the worst part, completely alert and intelligent, burning with the kind of focused intensity that belonged on a wolf, not a man. 13 years, he said, circling me slowly. 13 years of perfecting the art of the hunt, learning to think like prey so I could better catch predators. He carried weapons I couldn't immediately identify, things made from bones and stones and metal scavenged from the remains of his victims. But he moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost a confrontation, never met prey that couldn't be taken down. The thing about human predators, he continued, is that they rely on civilization to protect them. Take away the laws and police and social contracts and they become weak, pathetic things. But you might be different. I kept my service weapon trained on him, but he didn't seem concerned. If anything, the sight of my gun appeared to amuse him. Go ahead, he invited. Shoot me. Kill me. Become the thing you've spent your whole life trying to prevent. My finger tightened on the trigger, but I couldn't pull it. Everything I'd been trained for, every principle I'd sworn to uphold, prevented me from executing a man who hadn't directly threatened me yet. That's what I thought. Ezra's smile revealed teeth that had been filed to sharp points. Still thinking like a civilized man, still believing in arrest procedures and Miranda rights and due process. He moved faster than anything human should be able to move, crossing the 20 feet between us in what felt like a single bound. His improvised weapons, bones sharpened to razor edges, swept toward my throat with lethal precision. I barely got my arm up in time to block the attack, feeling the sharpened bone slice through my uniform sleeve and into the flesh beneath. The pain was immediate and intense, but it also triggered something primal in my brain, the same survival instinct that had kept humans alive for millennia before civilization taught us to hesitate. I brought my knee up hard, catching Ezra in the ribs and sending him staggering backward. As he recovered, I aimed my weapon at his center mass, finger on the trigger. Stop, I commanded. You're under arrest. He laughed, a sound that was more animal than human. There's no arrest out here, Ranger Morrison. No backup coming, no legal system to process me through. Just you and me, and the simple mathematics of survival. He came at me again, but this time I was ready. I squeezed the trigger, feeling the weapon buck in my hands, hearing the sharp crack of the gunshot echo off the canyon walls. The bullet caught Ezra in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to his knees among the scattered bones. But instead of crying out in pain or surrendering, he looked up at me with something that might have been approval. Better, he said, blood running down his arm. You're learning, but you're still holding back. Still trying to wound instead of kill. That's going to get you eaten alive. He was right. I'd aimed for his shoulder instead of center mass, still thinking like a law enforcement officer instead of someone fighting for his life. And in the wilderness, that hesitation could be fatal. Ezra rose to his feet, seemingly unaffected by the bullet wound. Blood soaked his makeshift clothing, but his movements remained fluid and predatory. He'd wrapped something around the wound, strips of hide that he must have prepared in advance, as if being shot was just another expected variable in his hunt. You see, he said, advancing again. You had the perfect opportunity to end this, but you chose mercy, chose to wound instead of kill. That's the difference between a civilized man and a survivor. I backed away, keeping the weapon trained on him, but he was right about one thing. I only had a few rounds left, and if I kept aiming to wound, I'd run out of ammunition long before I stopped him. The girl in the cave, he continued, still moving closer. How long do you think she has? The smoke will clear eventually, but hypothermia sets in fast at this altitude. And there are other things in these woods, Ranger Morrison. Things that are drawn to the scent of fear and helplessness. As if summoned by his words, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A low growling from somewhere above us, echoing off the canyon walls. Not human, but not quite animal either. My friends, Ezra explained with obvious satisfaction. I've been feeding them for years, teaching them to associate human scent with easy meals. They won't attack me. I'm pack leader. But you and the girl? You're fresh meat. The growling grew louder, and I caught glimpses of movement along the canyon rim, dark shapes that moved wrong, Too fluid for bears, too large for coyotes. Whatever Ezra had done to survive out here, he'd clearly made alliances with things that shouldn't exist. Last chance, Ranger Morrison. Join me willingly, and I'll make the girl's death quick. Fight me, and I'll let my pack have her while you watch. Something snapped inside me at those words. Not the careful breaking of a rational mind, but the sudden clarity that comes when survival instinct finally overrides civilized restraint. This wasn't about law enforcement anymore. This wasn't about arrest procedures or proper protocol. This was about a predator threatening an innocent woman, and I was the only thing standing between them. I raised my weapon and fired 3 times in quick succession, aiming for center mass just like they'd taught me at the academy. The shots echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and I saw Ezra stagger backward as at least 2 of the bullets found their mark. But he didn't go down. Instead, he smiled wider, revealing those filed teeth stained with blood. "Much better," he said, his voice now a raspy whisper. "Now you're thinking like a predator." He reached into his makeshift clothing and pulled out something that made my stomach lurch. A hand grenade, old military issue, with the pin already partially pulled. "Insurance policy," he explained. "If I can't have the hunt, nobody gets to leave this canyon." I had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether Celeste and I lived or died. The grenade would kill us all if it exploded in the confined space of the canyon, but if I could somehow get it away from us, I did the only thing I could think of. I charged him. The impact sent us both tumbling among the elk bones, a tangle of limbs and weapons in desperate violence. Ezra was stronger than his scarecrow appearance suggested, and he fought with the vicious efficiency of something that had killed many times before. His bone weapons sliced at my face and hands, and his filed teeth snapped at my throat like a rabid animal. But I had advantages he didn't expect: youth, training, and the desperate strength that comes from protecting someone you've sworn to save. I managed to wrap my hands around his wrist, the one holding the grenade, and we rolled across the bone-littered ground in a deadly embrace. The pin came free. I heard the metallic ping as it flew away into the darkness, followed by the distinctive clicking sound of the grenade's mechanism engaging. 4 seconds. Maybe 5 if we were lucky. With strength born of pure desperation, I tore the grenade from Ezra's grip and hurled it toward the far end of the canyon, as far from the cave entrance as I could manage. Then I threw myself toward the cave where Celeste was hiding, screaming for her to get as deep as possible. The explosion, when it came, was deafening in the confined space. The canyon walls amplified the sound until it felt like the earth itself was screaming. Rocks rained down from above, and a shockwave of dust and debris swept across the meadow like a miniature hurricane. When the dust settled, I found myself partially buried under fallen stones, my ears ringing so loudly that I could barely think. But I was alive, and when I looked back toward where Ezra had been, I saw only a crater filled with shattered bones and displaced earth. I dug my way out of the rubble and stumbled toward the cave, calling Celeste's name. She emerged from the darkness coughing and disoriented, but apparently unharmed. The explosion had cleared most of the smoke from the grenade, and although the cave entrance was partially blocked by fallen rocks, we could still squeeze through. But our celebration was premature. As we stood in the moonlit canyon surveying the destruction, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Slow, deliberate clapping from somewhere above us. I looked up toward the canyon rim and saw a figure silhouetted against the stars. Ezra, somehow alive, somehow unharmed, applauding our survival with obvious amusement. "Excellent work, Ranger Morrison," his voice echoed down to us. "You're learning faster than I expected, but the real lesson is just beginning." A rope dropped from above, landing near our feet. But this wasn't the frayed ladder from before. This was climbing rope, strong and new, with knots tied at regular intervals to make ascent easier. "One rope," Ezra called down. "Strong enough for 2 people this time. But here's the thing. I'm not going to let you both reach the top. One of you is going to fall. The question is, which one?" I looked at the rope, then at Celeste, understanding the horrible mathematics of our situation. We could try to climb together, but Ezra would be waiting at the top with weapons and 13 years of experience in killing. Or we could stay in the canyon and slowly die of exposure and thirst. There's a third option, Ezra continued as if reading my thoughts. One of you can stay behind voluntarily. Sacrifice yourself for the other. I promise to make it quick. A professional courtesy. Ranger to ranger. Celeste grabbed my arm, her grip fierce despite her exhaustion. Don't even think about it, she whispered. We both go up or neither of us does. But I was already calculating angles and distances, thinking like the tactical officer I'd been trained to be. The rope was about 60 feet long. If I could get Celeste most of the way up before Ezra acted, she might have a chance to escape over the rim while he was dealing with me. I'll go first, I told her quietly. Get you as high as possible before... No. Her voice was flat, final. I've been watching him for 2 days. He doesn't just kill people, Thane, he breaks them first. Makes them choose between their principles and their survival, then punishes them for whatever choice they make. She was right. This wasn't about escape. It was about psychological torture, about forcing us to reveal the selfish animals that Ezra believed lurked beneath every civilized facade. That's when I remembered something from my training, a technique for dealing with hostage situations where the perpetrator was trying to force impossible choices. Sometimes the only winning move was to refuse to play the game. What if we don't choose? I called up to Ezra. Silence from above. Then after a long moment, what do you mean? I mean, what if we refuse to participate in your little experiment? What if we just sit here and wait for rescue? I heard him laugh, but there was less confidence in the sound than before. No one's coming, Ranger Morrison. I told you. I intercepted your radio communications. As far as the Park Service knows, you found Celeste safe and sound hours ago. Maybe. But park rangers have check-in schedules. When I don't report back by midnight, they'll send out a search team. And when they find my patrol vehicle at the trailhead, they'll follow your trail, just like you followed hers. And they'll end up exactly where you are now. He was right again. But I was learning to think like him, to anticipate his moves the way he'd been anticipating mine. You're getting old, Ezra, I called out. 13 years of living rough, eating poorly, treating wounds with makeshift medical supplies. How many more years do you think you have before your body starts failing? Before you make a mistake that gets you killed? What's your point? My point is that you need me. You need someone younger, stronger, someone who knows current park service procedures and can help you hunt more efficiently. That's what this has all been about. Not killing me, but recruiting me. The silence from above stretched on for so long that I began to wonder if I'd guessed wrong, if Ezra had simply vanished into the night to plan our deaths from a distance. But finally his voice drifted down again, and this time it carried a note of genuine curiosity. Go on. The missing person cases. You've been staging them, haven't you? Drawing rangers into situations where they have to choose between protocol and survival, then keeping the ones who choose survival. I was guessing, extrapolating from limited information, but Celeste was nodding beside me as if pieces were falling into place in her mind as well. How many others have there been? I continued. How many rangers have you recruited over the years? 7, he said finally. 7 who understood that civilization is a lie, that law and order are just convenient fictions that protect the weak from the strong. And where are they now? Another long pause. Gone. Accidents mostly. One tried to leave, had to be put down. Another went soft, started questioning the necessity of what we do. The wilderness is demanding, Ranger Morrison. It requires constant proof of worthiness. I felt Celeste shudder beside me, understanding as I did that we weren't just dealing with a single madman but with something worse, a recruitment system that had been operating for over a decade, drawing law enforcement personnel into corruption and murder. So what's the test? I asked. What do I have to do to prove I'm worthy? Killer. The words dropped into the canyon like stones, heavy and final. Kill the photographer. Show me that you understand the fundamental truth, that individual survival matters more than civilized morality. Do that, and I'll teach you everything I know about real law enforcement. Celeste's grip on my arm tightened, but she didn't speak. She understood, as I did, that this was the moment Ezra had been orchestrating since the beginning, not a rescue mission gone wrong, but a carefully planned psychological breakdown designed to transform a civilized man into a predator. I looked down at my service weapon, still in my hand, then up at the canyon rim where Ezra waited in the darkness. The mathematics were simple. Kill an innocent woman to save my own life, or refuse and watch both of us die slowly in this natural prison. But there was a third option, one that Ezra hadn't considered because he'd spent so many years thinking like a predator that he'd forgotten how civilized people actually think. "I'll do it," I called up to him. Celeste stared at me in horror, but I squeezed her hand in what I hoped she'd recognize as reassurance. "But not down here," I continued. "If I'm going to cross that line, if I'm going to become what you want me to be, I want to do it properly. Bring us both up and I'll kill her on solid ground where you can watch." "Thane, no," Celeste whispered, but I kept my eyes focused on the canyon rim. "Smart," Ezra said finally. "Very smart. But how do I know you won't try something heroic once you reach the top?" "Because I'm not a hero," I replied, putting as much weary resignation into my voice as I could manage. "I'm a 27-year-old kid who's been in the job for 14 months and just wants to go home alive. You want to see my real nature? Fine, but I'm not doing it in a hole in the ground." The rope started moving, pulled up by invisible hands. When it came back down, there was a crude harness attached, leather straps that looked like they'd been made from human skin. "Ladies first," Ezra called down. "But remember, Ranger Morrison, if either of you tries anything heroic during the climb, I'll cut the rope and let gravity handle the rest." Celeste looked at me with a mixture of terror and betrayal, but I helped her into the harness anyway, whispering instructions that I hoped Ezra couldn't hear from above. "When you reach the top, run," I told her quietly. "Don't look back. Don't try to help me. Just run for the forest and keep running until you reach the road." "I won't leave you." "Yes, you will, because that's the only way either of us survives this." She began to climb, her ascent smooth and steady despite her exhaustion. I watched her rise toward the canyon rim, counting the seconds, calculating how long I'd have to implement the desperate plan that was forming in my mind. When she was about 40 feet up, nearly within reach of the top, I made my move. Instead of waiting for the rope to come back down, I began free climbing the canyon wall. The limestone was treacherous, slick with moisture and crumbling under my weight. But I'd done enough rock climbing in my training to know the basics. More importantly, I was counting on Ezra being distracted by Celeste's arrival at the rim. I was perhaps 20 feet up when I heard the commotion above. Celeste screaming, Ezra shouting, the sounds of a struggle. But I didn't look up, didn't let myself think about what might be happening. I just kept climbing hand over hand toward whatever confrontation awaited me at the top. My muscles were screaming with exhaustion by the time I hauled myself over the canyon rim, and what I saw there nearly made me fall backward into the abyss. Celeste was on her knees at the edge of the cliff, Ezra behind her with one of his bone knives pressed against her throat. But what made my blood freeze was the realization that Ezra wasn't alone. 3 other figures stood in the darkness behind him. Men in tattered Park Service uniforms, their faces bearing the same hollow, predatory expression as their leader. "Ah, Ranger Morrison," Ezra said without turning around. "I was wondering when you'd join us. Creative climbing technique, by the way. Very resourceful." The other men stepped forward, and in the moonlight I could see that they carried weapons. Real ones, not the improvised tools that Ezra favored. Service pistols, tactical knives, equipment that had clearly been taken from other law enforcement personnel over the years. "Let me introduce my associates," Ezra continued. "Former Rangers Thompson, Martinez, and Chen. Each of them faced the same choice you're facing now. Each of them chose survival over principle." The men stared at me with empty eyes, and I realized that whatever had broken in Ezra during his years in the wilderness had been passed on to them like a psychological infection. They weren't just accomplices. They were victims who had become predators, civilized men who had been systematically destroyed and rebuilt in Ezra's image. "Now then," Ezra said, pressing the knife closer to Celeste's throat. "Let's see what you're really made of, Ranger Morrison. Kill her and join us. Refuse and we'll kill you both, but we'll take our time with it. I looked at Celeste, seeing the trust in her eyes despite everything that had happened. She believed in me, believed that I would find a way to save both of us. And in that moment I realized that her faith wasn't misplaced, not because I was particularly heroic or clever, but because I'd finally understood something that Ezra had missed in his calculations. He'd assumed that when pushed to the breaking point, civilized people would abandon their principles to save themselves. But he'd forgotten that sometimes, when everything else falls away, principles are all that's left. I raised my service weapon, pointing it not at Celeste but at Ezra himself. "Here's my choice," I said quietly. "I'm going to count to 3. If you don't release her by the time I reach 0, I'm going to put a bullet through your brain." Ezra laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. "You won't do it. Shoot me, and my men will kill you both before you can blink." "Maybe, but you'll still be dead. And somehow, I don't think that's part of your long-term survival plan." The 3 corrupted rangers shifted nervously, clearly unsure how to react to a situation their leader hadn't prepared them for. They were followers, not independent thinkers, and without clear orders from Ezra, they seemed paralyzed. "1," I said, steadying my aim. "You're bluffing," Ezra said, but he'd stopped pressing the knife against Celeste's throat. 2. "Think about what you're doing, Morrison. Think about the consequences. Kill me, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder wondering when my associates will come for you." 3. I squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean, catching Ezra center mass and sending him stumbling backward away from Celeste. But even as he fell, I was already moving, grabbing Celeste and pulling her away from the cliff edge, while keeping my weapon trained on the other 3 men. "Run," I told her. "Now." She hesitated for a moment, then disappeared into the forest with the speed of someone who had spent 2 days learning that hesitation could be fatal. The 3 corrupted rangers stood in a loose semicircle around Ezra's body, staring down at their dead leader with expressions of complete bewilderment. Without him to give them direction, they seemed lost, uncertain about what to do next. "It's over," I told them, my weapon moving from one to the next. "Your leader is dead. You can walk away from this, get help, try to find your way back to who you used to be." But I could see in their eyes that it was too late for redemption. Whatever Ezra had done to them, whatever psychological conditioning he'd used to transform them from law enforcement officers into predators, had taken root too deeply to be easily reversed. Thompson, the oldest of the 3, was the first to move. His hand dropped toward his holstered weapon with the smooth motion of someone who had killed many times before. I shot him before he could clear leather. Martinez and Chen rushed me simultaneously, coming from opposite directions with the coordinated tactics of experienced operators. But they'd forgotten that I was still a law enforcement officer, still trained in combat techniques that didn't rely on psychological manipulation and wilderness survival skills. The fight was brief and vicious. Chen went down with a broken neck after trying to tackle me from behind. Martinez lasted longer, managing to get his hands around my throat before I put my knife between his ribs. When it was over, I stood alone among the bodies of 4 men who had once sworn the same oath I had, who had once dedicated their lives to protecting innocent people. The irony wasn't lost on me. In order to save 1 life, I'd been forced to take 4 others. I found Celeste about a quarter mile away, hiding behind a fallen log and shaking with shock and exhaustion. Together we made our way back to the trailhead, following game trails and navigating by the stars, until we reached my patrol vehicle just as the sun was beginning to rise. The official report listed the incident as a confrontation with armed survivalists who had been living illegally in the backcountry. Ezra Blackwood's name appeared in the files as a person of interest in several missing person cases dating back over a decade, but the full scope of his activities was never made public. Celeste recovered from her ordeal, though she never returned to wilderness photography. The last I heard, she was working as a teacher in Seattle, helping children who had experienced trauma. As for me, I remained with the Park Service for another 3 years before transferring to a desk job with the Forest Service. I told myself it was because I wanted to move up the administrative ladder, But the truth was simpler. I couldn't spend another night alone in the wilderness without hearing Ezra's voice echoing through the trees, without wondering if there were others like him still out there, still hunting. Because the most terrifying thing about that October night in 2003 wasn't the violence or the psychological torture, or even the realization that civilization is much thinner than we like to believe. It was the understanding that Ezra Blackwood had been right about one thing. When everything else falls away, when survival is the only imperative that matters, we discover what we really are beneath the comfortable lies we tell ourselves. I learned that I was capable of killing without hesitation when innocent lives were at stake. I learned that I could make impossible choices and live with the consequences. I learned that there's a predator inside every human being, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The question that still haunts me 15 years later isn't whether I made the right choices that night. It's whether those choices changed something fundamental inside me, whether I crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Sometimes, when I'm walking through the woods near my suburban home, I catch myself moving with the silent efficiency that Ezra tried to teach me. I notice things that civilians miss: broken branches, disturbed earth, the subtle signs that someone has passed this way before. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if the real lesson of that night wasn't about the thin line between civilization and savagery, but about the even thinner line between hunter and hunted. Because in the end, we're all predators. The only question is what we choose to hunt. My name is Kira Thornfield, and I am 26 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 months. This happened during the fall of 2001, when the missing person case of Ezra Blackwood turned into something that still haunts me. I was still new to the job, only 8 months in, when the call came through on that gray October morning. The radio crackled with Supervisor Martinez's voice cutting through the static. "Thornfield, we've got a missing person. Ezra Blackwood, 34, wildlife photographer. Last seen 3 days ago near the Hoh River Trail junction. Family's getting anxious." 3 days. In October. In Olympics backcountry where temperatures dropped to near freezing after sunset and the rain came down like punishment from above. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the one that reminded me I was still proving myself, still the rookie who got the assignments nobody else wanted to take. "Copy that," I responded, trying to keep the uncertainty out of my voice. "What's his last known position?" "Mile marker 7 on the Hoh River Trail. He was photographing elk migration patterns for some nature magazine. Had permits for a week-long backcountry stay. Should have checked in yesterday." I grabbed my gear with practiced efficiency, the routine movements helping calm my nerves. GPS unit, first aid kit, emergency radio, headlamp, survival blanket, water purification tablets. The Glock 22 felt heavy on my hip. 8 months in, and I'd never drawn it outside of training. Part of me hoped I never would. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes through increasingly dense forest. October in the Pacific Northwest meant darkness by 5 p.m., and it was already past noon. The ancient Douglas firs pressed close to the narrow road, their massive trunks disappearing into fog that seemed to swallow sound itself. Even with the truck's heater running, cold seeped through the windows like something alive. At the trailhead, I found Blackwood's silver Honda Civic exactly where his permit indicated. The car was unlocked, not unusual for someone planning to return the same day, but he'd been gone for 3 days. Inside, I found nothing immediately helpful. A thermos that still smelled of coffee, some energy bars, a road atlas folded to Washington State. The back seat held camera equipment cases, empty but for foam inserts showing where expensive lenses had been removed. I keyed my radio. "Thornfield to base. Located subject's vehicle. Beginning trail search now." "Copy, Thornfield. Check in every hour on the hour. And Kira?" Martinez's voice carried that tone that made my spine straighten. "By the book. No hero stuff." "Understood." The Hoh River Trail wound through temperate rainforest so dense it created its own weather system. Moisture hung in the air like suspended glass beads, and every surface, bark, stone, fallen logs, glistened with a film of water that never quite dried. My boots squelched through mud that grabbed at each step, and within minutes my uniform pants were soaked to the knees. The silence was wrong. 8 months patrolling these trails had taught me the forest's rhythms, and this felt different. No bird calls, no scurrying in the underbrush, no chittering of squirrels. Even the river seemed muted, its usual cheerful babble reduced to a whispered murmur. The hair on my arm stood up beneath my jacket sleeves. At mile marker 3, I found the first sign of Blackwood's passage. A cigarette butt, half buried in mud. Marlboro Light, still showing traces of the gold filter despite 3 days of rain. I bagged it, though I wasn't sure why. The academy had drilled evidence collection into us, but this was a missing person case, not a crime scene. Still, something about the forest's unnatural quiet made me treat every detail as potentially critical. Mile marker 5 brought another discovery. Footprints in a patch of soft earth beside a fallen cedar. Size 11 hiking boots. Deep impressions suggesting a heavy pack. The tread pattern was clear enough that I could make out the manufacturer's logo, Vasque. I photographed them with the digital camera for my pack, trying to remember the proper procedure for scaling shots. Was it a quarter for reference, or was that just something from TV shows? The prints headed north off the main trail and into thicker forest. I hesitated. Protocol said to mark the location and call for backup before leaving established trails. But protocol also said missing persons cases were time critical, and I was already losing daylight. I keyed the radio. Thornfield to base, found tracks leading north from mile marker 5. Pursuing. Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing but white noise. The GPS unit showed I was exactly where I should be, well within radio range. Equipment failure wasn't uncommon in the deep forest. Too much moisture, too much interference from the terrain. But the timing felt deliberate somehow, as if the forest itself had decided I needed to face this alone. I marked the spot with fluorescent tape tied to a branch and followed the tracks north. The undergrowth grew thicker with each step, forcing me to push through curtains of fern and devil's club that left my jacket dripping. The ground beneath my feet became softer, spongier, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves that muffled every sound. 20 minutes in, I found Blackwood's first campsite. The clearing was maybe 15 feet across, ringed by massive Sitka spruces whose canopy blocked most of the gray sky. In the center, someone had built a fire ring from river stones. The ashes were cold and wet, but I could smell the ghost of wood smoke when the wind shifted. Nearby, 4 tent stakes remained driven into the earth in a perfect rectangle, but it was what surrounded the campsite that made my breath catch. Photography equipment lay scattered in the ferns like expensive confetti. A telephoto lens, its glass spider-webbed but not completely shattered. A digital camera body, its LCD screen dark and cracked. Memory cards gleamed like tiny jewels among the decomposing leaves. And everywhere, strips of developed film hung from branches like prayer flags, images of elk and forest scenes swaying in the damp breeze. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. I photographed everything, my hands trembling slightly as I worked. The destruction felt personal somehow, as if someone had taken great pleasure in dismantling not just equipment but dreams. Each broken piece had been placed deliberately, artistically. Someone had spent time here after Blackwood left or was taken. At the clearing's edge, I found more footprints. The Vasque boots again, but now accompanied by a second set. Larger, military-style combat boots with a distinctive waffle pattern on the sole. These prints were deeper, pressed into the earth with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I followed the dual trail north, my unease growing with each step. The combat boot prints showed no hesitation, no backtracking or course corrections. Whoever wore them knew this forest intimately. The Vasque prints, by contrast, wandered slightly, the gait of someone being led or following reluctantly. My radio crackled suddenly, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. Thornfield, this is base. Status report. Martinez's voice was faint but clear. I keyed the transmit button eagerly. Base, this is Thornfield. Found subject's equipment scattered at an abandoned campsite. Looks like vandalism or something worse. Following dual trail north from position. Negative, Thornfield. Return to main trail immediately. We're sending backup. Sir, I'm close to something here. The trail is fresh and that's an order, Ranger. Return to main trail and wait for backup. The radio cut to static again. I tried several more times, but whatever had briefly cleared the interference was gone. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pregnant with watching eyes. I looked back the way I'd come, then forward along the trail that disappeared into increasingly thick forest. Protocol demanded I return and wait, but protocols were written by people who'd never stood in a forest where every shadow might hide a missing person, where every minute of delay could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. I kept moving north. The trail led deeper into Olympic's interior, far from any established path. The trees grew larger here, ancient giants whose trunks could hide a dozen people. Moss hung in curtains from every branch, creating a maze of green that seemed to shift and breathe in my peripheral vision. The temperature was dropping as afternoon wore into evening, and my breath began to mist with each exhalation. At what I estimated to be 2 miles from the campsite, the track stopped at the edge of a creek. The water was maybe 10 feet wide, running fast and deep between banks lined with slick stones. Both sets of footprints approached the water's edge and simply ended. No prints on the opposite bank, no disturbed vegetation, no indication which direction they'd gone. I stood there for several minutes, studying the scene and fighting a growing sense of helplessness. The textbook said to search both directions along the creek looking for exit points. But textbooks didn't account for the way shadows seemed to move independently here, or how the sound of running water could mask approaching footsteps. That's when I heard it, faint, almost lost in the creek's babble, a voice calling for help. "Hello? Hello, is someone there? Please help me." The voice came from somewhere upstream, thin and desperate. Male, probably the right age to be Blackwood. I felt a surge of relief mixed with adrenaline. This was it. The successful rescue that would prove I belonged here. That 8 months of doubt and second-guessing hadn't been wasted. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Thornfield. I've made contact with possible subject, requesting immediate backup at..." I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only static. "Requesting backup on Ho River tributary, approximately 2 miles north of mile marker 5. No response. Not even static this time. The voice called again, more urgently. "Please, I'm hurt. I can't move." I followed the creek upstream, moving carefully over the wet stones. The voice grew stronger with each step, echoing off the water in a way that made it hard to pinpoint exactly, but it was definitely ahead of me, somewhere in the thickening mist that rose from the creek's surface. "I'm coming," I called back. "I'm a park ranger. Stay where you are." "Thank God. Hurry, please. Something's wrong with my leg." I rounded a bend in the creek and saw him. Ezra Blackwood sat against a fallen log about 50 yards upstream, one leg extended at an unnatural angle. Even from a distance, I could see the pain etched on his face, the way he cradled his left arm against his chest. His photographer's vest was torn and muddy, and his dark hair was matted with what looked like blood. "Blackwood?" I called as I approached. "Ezra Blackwood?" Yes, that's me. Oh God, I thought no one would find me." I covered the remaining distance quickly, my training kicking in. Primary survey first. Airway, breathing, circulation. He was conscious and talking, so airway was clear. His breathing seemed labored but steady, no obvious bleeding, though that could be hidden by the dirt and torn clothing. "I'm Ranger Thornfield," I said, kneeling beside him. "You've been missing for 3 days. What happened?" His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with pain or shock. "I was photographing the elk migration when someone attacked me. A man in ranger gear, but wrong somehow. He destroyed my equipment, chased me through the forest. I think my leg is broken." I examined the injured leg carefully. Definitely broken, probably the tibia, but the bone wasn't protruding through the skin. The arm looked like a possible fracture too. He needed immediate medical attention, but he was stable enough for transport if I could get backup. "Did you recognize the man who attacked you?" I asked, unpacking my first aid kit. Blackwood's face went pale. He said he was hunting me. Like I was an animal. He knew the forest better than anyone I've ever seen. Moved through it like a ghost. I only escaped because of a rock slide near the river. As I began immobilizing his leg with the splint materials from my kit, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. What did he look like? Tall, maybe 6'2", gray beard, military bearing. His ranger uniform looked real, but there was something about his eyes. Blackwood shuddered, like he enjoyed watching me run. I keyed my radio again, hoping the creek's location might improve reception. Base, this is Thornfield. I've located Ezra Blackwood. He's alive but injured, possible fractures to left leg and arm. Requesting immediate medical evacuation and law enforcement backup. Subject reports being attacked by unknown individual in Park Service uniform. Static, always static. The radio's not working, I told Blackwood. But don't worry, I left a trail, and backup should find us soon. Can you tell me anything else about your attacker? Blackwood grabbed my wrist with his good hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Ranger, you don't understand. He's still out there. He told me he was going to let me live just long enough to bring other rangers to him. Said it had been too long since he'd had a real challenge. The words hit me like ice water. I'd walked into a trap. Everything. The scattered equipment, the clear trail, even finding Blackwood, had been orchestrated to bring me here. Alone. We need to move, I said, finishing the splint as quickly as possible. Can you walk with support? I can try, but... The crack of a breaking branch echoed through the forest, too sharp and deliberate to be accidental. It came from somewhere behind us, back toward the main trail. My hand moved instinctively to my sidearm. Ranger Thornfield, a voice called from the mist. Deep, confident with the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to authority. I believe you're looking for me. I helped Blackwood to his feet, supporting his weight as he balanced on his good leg. We're leaving. Now. But as we started downstream, combat boots appeared through the mist. Size 12 or 13, moving with the silent confidence of someone who'd walked these trails for years. Above them, gray uniform pants bloused into the boots in perfect military fashion. A figure emerged from the fog like something out of a nightmare. He was exactly as Blackwood had described, tall, lean with silver gray hair and beard trimmed to regulation length. The Park Service uniform looked authentic down to the last detail, complete with name tag, badge, and radio. But there was something wrong with his eyes. Too bright, too focused, like a predator that had found its prey. Ranger Dalton Reeves, he said, touching the brim of his campaign hat in a mock salute. Formerly of Olympic National Park, currently enjoying my retirement. I knew that name. Every ranger in the Pacific Northwest knew it. Dalton Reeves had been a legend. 23 years of service, countless rescues, 3 commendations for valor. He'd disappeared 2 years ago after an internal investigation into excessive force complaints. The official story was early retirement and relocation to Arizona. Reeves, I said, keeping my voice steady. Step aside. I'm evacuating an injured civilian. His laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, Kira. May I call you Kira? You still don't understand. Mr. Blackwood isn't injured. Well, not seriously. Those splints you just applied so expertly? Completely unnecessary. Show her, Ezra. To my horror, Blackwood straightened up, putting full weight on his supposedly broken leg. The pain-twisted expression melted from his face, replaced by something cold and calculating. Sorry, Ranger, he said, his voice now carrying the same predatory edge as Reeves's. Nothing personal. I stumbled backward, my hand finally closing around my sidearm. But Reeves was faster, his own weapon appearing in his hand with practiced ease. A Glock 22, identical to mine but modified with a suppressor. I wouldn't, he said conversationally. 23 years of service taught me to shoot first and investigate later. Bad habit, really. Cost me my badge. My mind raced through options, training scenarios, anything that might get me out of this alive. But every possibility ended the same way, with 2 experienced hunters and 1 rookie ranger who'd walked blindly into their trap. What do you want? I asked. What I've always wanted, Reeves replied. A worthy challenge. Do you know how boring it is to hunt deer, Kira? They're stupid creatures, all instinct and panic, no sport in it at all. But humans, his eyes gleamed. Humans can think. They can plan, adapt, surprise you. They make the hunt interesting. The missing hikers last summer, I said, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. The ones who were never found. Learning experiences, he said with a shrug. Practice rounds. But they were all civilians. Soft, unprepared city folk who panicked at the first sign of danger. No real challenge. Then I realized what I needed. Someone with training. Someone who knew the forest, understood survival techniques. Someone like a park ranger. Blackwood, or whatever his real name was, smiled. The photographer story was my idea. Ezra Blackwood doesn't exist, by the way. Just a name and a backstory designed to get you out here alone. Your equipment. Thrift store camera gear and staged photographs. Dalton's quite the artist when it comes to scene composition. I felt sick. Every decision I'd made, every protocol I'd followed or broken had been anticipated and manipulated. They'd played me like a marionette from the moment I'd left the trailhead. Here's how this works, Reeves said, holstering his weapon. You get a 15-minute head start. Use it wisely. After that, we hunt. If you can survive until dawn and reach the main trail, you win. You go home, tell whatever story you like, and we disappear forever. And if I don't? His smile was all teeth. Then you become another missing hiker. These woods have a way of swallowing people, don't they? I looked at the two men blocking my path back to the main trail, then at the deepening forest that stretched endlessly north. No radio, no GPS, no backup coming. Just me, the growing darkness, and two killers who knew every inch of these woods. 15 minutes, Reeves said, checking his watch. Starting now. I ran. The creek became my highway, its rocky bed offering firmer footing than the boggy forest floor. I moved as quickly as I dared, jumping from stone to stone, trying to keep my boots from splashing too loudly in the water. Behind me, I could hear their laughter fading into the mist. The textbook said to find high ground, establish a defensive position, conserve energy. But textbooks were written for scenarios involving lost hikers and natural disasters, not human predators who knew every tactical manual better than I did. Everything I'd learned, they'd learned first. Every advantage I thought I had was actually theirs. The creek curved east, taking me deeper into the park's interior. I followed it for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my lungs burning from the cold air and adrenaline. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the silence was complete. No pursuing footsteps, no snapping branches, nothing but the creek's whisper and my own ragged breathing. That's when I realized the true horror of my situation. They weren't chasing me because they didn't need to. This was their territory, their hunting ground. They could track me at their leisure, drive me wherever they wanted me to go, toy with me until they got bored. I was the deer now. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, close enough that I should have heard the approach. I spun around, drawing my sidearm, but saw only mist and shadows. The sound could have been anything. A falling branch, a small animal, the forest settling in the cooling air. Or it could have been a message, a reminder that they were there, watching, waiting. I kept moving upstream, forcing myself to think tactically. Advantages. I was younger, presumably in better shape, and desperate enough to take risks they might not expect. Disadvantages. Everything else. They knew the terrain, had night vision equipment if they needed it, and most critically, they'd done this before. The creek split around a small island of jumbled boulders. I took the right channel, hoping to mask my trail in the faster-moving water. The stones were slick with moss, and twice I nearly fell, my boots skittering on surfaces that felt greased. Each stumble sent echoes bouncing off the water that seemed to announce my position to anyone listening. That's when I heard the elk call. It drifted through the mist like something from a nature documentary, the haunting bugle of a bull elk in rut. But it was October, past rutting season, and the call came from directly ahead of me. No elk would position itself in a creek bed, and the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. They were hurting me. I stopped, knee-deep in rushing water, and tried to think like a hunter instead of prey. Where did they want me to go? What advantage were they trying to gain? The false elk call suggested they wanted me to continue upstream, toward whatever trap they'd prepared. Instead, I climbed out of the creek and struck out due east, into the thickest part of the forest. The undergrowth here was nearly impenetrable, a maze of fallen logs, devil's club, and fern that grew head-high. I pushed through it like a drowning person fighting toward air, branches catching at my uniform and pack. The noise was unavoidable, but stealth was already compromised. Now it was about unpredictability, making choices they hadn't planned for. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead of me, sweeping left and right in a methodical search pattern. I dropped to my belly behind a massive fallen cedar and tried to control my breathing. The light was maybe 50 yards away, close enough that I could hear boots moving through the underbrush. "She's not following the creek anymore," Blackwood's voice called from somewhere to my left. "Smart girl, making this interesting." "She's heading for the ranger station," Reeves replied, his voice coming from my right. They had me bracketed, were closing from two sides like wolves driving prey toward waiting partners. "Intercept her at the old growth grove. I'll push from here." The ranger station. I tried to orient myself, remembering the maps I'd studied during training. There was an abandoned fire lookout about 3 miles northeast, a wooden tower built in the 1940s and decommissioned when satellite monitoring made it obsolete. If that's what they meant, it was defensible ground with radio equipment that might still work. Or it was another trap. I waited until the flashlight beams moved away, then continued east. The forest began to change as I climbed higher, the dense undergrowth giving way to more mature trees with less brush between them. My boots found firmer ground, and for the first time since leaving the creek, I could move without sounding like a bulldozer. But with visibility came vulnerability. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in silver patches that would silhouette me against the darkness. I stuck to the deepest shadows, moving from trunk to trunk in what I hoped was an unpredictable pattern. A branch cracked somewhere behind me, then another, off to my right. They were still there, still tracking, still closing the distance between us. How were they following me so easily? Even with experience and superior knowledge of the terrain, tracking someone through thick forest at night should have been nearly impossible. Unless they weren't tracking me at all. Unless they knew exactly where I was going. I stopped beside a massive Douglas fir and really listened for the first time since the chase began. Under the normal forest sounds, wind in branches, creaking wood, distant water, I could hear something else, a faint electronic beeping, rhythmic and persistent. My GPS unit. I'd been so focused on the screen malfunction that I hadn't considered the device might still be transmitting. The GPS in my pack was broadcasting my location to anyone with the right receiver, laying out my exact path through the forest like breadcrumbs. With shaking hands, I pulled the unit from my pack and smashed it against the tree trunk. The beeping stopped, but the damage was already done. They'd been following an electronic trail, not footprints or broken branches. Every step I'd taken, every change of direction, every moment I thought I'd gained some tactical advantage, they'd known about it in real time. "There she is," Reeves's voice called from somewhere much closer than it should have been. "Lost your technological edge, didn't you, Ranger?" I ran again, abandoning stealth for speed. Branches whipped past my face, roots caught at my boots. But I pushed forward with the desperate energy of someone who'd finally understood how completely she'd been outmaneuvered. The old growth grove was still ahead, still potentially defensible. But now I knew they'd be waiting. The forest opened into a cathedral space where ancient trees reached toward stars barely visible through the canopy. Some of the giants here were probably 1,000 years old, their trunks so wide that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. In the center of the grove, moonlight illuminated the skeletal remains of the fire tower. It looked like the bones of some prehistoric creature. The wooden ladder still clung to one side, and the observation platform remained intact 50 feet above ground. But the stairs had partially collapsed, leaving gaps that would be treacherous to navigate in darkness. I studied the structure, trying to see it as a tactical position rather than a death trap. High ground, single approach route, difficult for attackers to reach without exposing themselves. The radio equipment was probably useless after decades of weather exposure, but the height advantage might let me signal aircraft or other ranger patrols. If I could reach it. I was halfway to the ladder when the first shot rang out. The suppressed report was barely louder than a breaking branch, but the bullet's impact on bark next to my head left no doubt about its intent. I dove for cover behind the nearest tree, as a second shot splintered wood where I'd been standing. "That was your warning shot," Reeves called from the edge of the grove. "The next one won't miss." I pressed my back against the rough bark and tried to locate his position. The shots had come from my right, maybe 30 yards away. If Blackwood was positioned to my left, they had the tower completely covered. "You know," Reeves continued conversationally, "this is where I killed my first ranger. Rookie, just like you, full of regulations and procedures and absolute confidence that training would see him through. Took him 6 hours to die after I gut shot him. Kept calling for backup right until the end." The words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't just about the hunt anymore, it was personal. Reeves wasn't just killing rangers, he was executing the entire institution that had rejected him, getting revenge on every rule and regulation and superior officer who'd questioned his methods. "How many?" I called back, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Rangers? You'd be number 4. Though technically Patterson doesn't count since he never made it out of the academy. 4 rangers dead, and no one had connected the disappearances. How was that possible? But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. Different parks, different jurisdictions, different explanations for missing personnel. A training accident here, a bear attack there, a simple disappearance that could be explained by any number of wilderness hazards. "The FBI will figure it out eventually," I said. His laugh echoed off the ancient trees. "Will they? Missing Ranger Thornfield, last seen pursuing a non-existent photographer into Olympic's backcountry. Rookie ranger, known for taking unnecessary risks and ignoring protocol. Probably fell into a ravine or got turned around in the fog. These things happen." Movement flickered at the edge of my vision, Blackwood circling to my left, trying to get an angle on my position. I shifted around the tree trunk, keeping the massive fir between us, but that exposed me to Reeves on the right. I was running out of options. The tower remained the only defensible position, but reaching it meant crossing 30 yards of open ground under fire from 2 trained killers. Even if I made it to the ladder, they could simply wait at the bottom until I came down or died of exposure. Unless I changed the rules of engagement. I pulled the emergency flare from my pack and held it ready. Standard equipment for all backcountry rangers, designed to signal rescue aircraft or mark locations for helicopter evacuation, but it could also serve as a weapon or distraction under the right circumstances. "Tell me about the others," I called out, trying to keep them talking while I planned my next move. "The rangers you killed. What were their names? Does it matter?" Reeves sounded genuinely puzzled. "They're dead. You'll be dead soon. Names are just sounds. It matters to me." A long pause, filled only with wind through the canopy. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, a note of pride, of accomplishment. "Martinez was first. Senior ranger at Mount Rainier, 20 years experience. Thought he could track me through a blizzard. Found his body in a crevasse 3 months later. Natural causes, they said. Hypothermia." My blood turned to ice. Martinez was my supervisor, very much alive and probably coordinating the search for me right now. Unless... "Still alive, isn't he?" I said. "You're lying. About Martinez?" "Yes, that was artistic license, but Thompson at Yellowstone was real. So was Chenook Glacier. And now you." The admission confirmed what I'd suspected. He was playing psychological games, trying to break my will to resist. But it also revealed something important. He needed to talk, needed to explain himself to someone who would understand the significance of what he'd done. That need might be his weakness. I pulled the pin on the flare and let the spoon fly. The magnesium charge ignited with a brilliant red flash that turned the grove into a hellscape of dancing shadows. I sprinted toward the tower, using the temporary blindness and confusion to cover my approach. Behind me, I heard cursing and the snap of branches as my pursuers tried to reposition. The ladder was older than I'd expected, its wooden rungs soft with rot. The first few held my weight, but the fourth cracked ominously under my boots. I climbed faster, testing each rung quickly before committing my full weight, acutely aware that a fall from this height would end the chase permanently. A shot rang out below me, the bullet gouging splinters from the rung near my hand. Then another, closer this time. I scrambled upward as fast as I dared, feeling the ancient wood flex and groan with each movement. The observation platform was a skeleton of weather-beaten planks surrounded by a railing that looked ready to collapse at the slightest touch. But it was solid enough to hold my weight, and more importantly, it gave me a commanding view of the grove below. The flare had burned out, but my eyes had adapted enough to make out two figures moving between the trees. They were being careful now, using the massive trunks for cover, but they had to expose themselves to get clear shots at the tower. I drew my sidearm and tried to remember my marksmanship training. Shooting in daylight at a controlled range was completely different from firing at moving targets in near darkness, while adrenaline turned my hands into vibrating leaves. But I had to try. Reeves broke cover first, sprinting from one tree to another in a practiced tactical movement. I led him slightly and squeezed the trigger, the muzzle flash temporarily destroying my night vision. The shot went wide, but it forced him back into cover. "Not bad," he called up. "But you only have 14 rounds left and we have all night." He was right. Even if I was a perfect shot, which I definitely wasn't, I couldn't hold this position indefinitely. They could wait me out, take turns keeping me pinned while the other rested, or simply set fire to the tower and smoke me out. But they couldn't prevent me from using the radio. The emergency radio was built into a metal box bolted to the platform's floor. Decades of weather had corroded the antenna connections and left the controls green with oxidation, but the LED status light glowed amber when I switched it on. Emergency power, probably from a battery pack that had been replaced sometime in the last few years. I keyed the microphone, praying that someone, somewhere, was monitoring the emergency frequency. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Ranger Kira Thornfield, Olympic National Park. I am under attack by armed suspects approximately 3 miles northeast of the Ho River Trail. 2 suspects, both armed, at least one claiming to be former Park Service personnel. I am trapped in the old fire tower and require immediate assistance." Static answered me, but different static. The kind that suggested someone might be receiving but unable to respond clearly. I tried again, varying the frequency slightly. Any station, this is Ranger Thornfield requesting immediate assistance. Officer in distress, shots fired, suspects are..." The radio exploded in sparks and smoke as a bullet found its mark. Reeves had climbed high enough in one of the surrounding trees to get an angle on the platform, and his shot had been perfectly placed to destroy the equipment without hitting me. "Can't have you calling for backup," he said, his voice now coming from above me and to the left. "That would ruin the sport." I looked up and saw him maybe 40 feet away, perched in the branches of a massive cedar like some kind of predatory bird. The rifle in his hands looked military, probably an M24 or similar precision weapon. At this range in his hands it might as well have been a death sentence. "Impressive climb," I called up to him. "Most men your age couldn't make it 10 feet up a tree." Flattery? Really? But I could hear pleasure in his voice. "You're stalling, hoping that radio transmission got through before I shot it." "Did it? We'll find out, won't we? But I wouldn't hold my breath if I were you. Emergency frequencies aren't monitored as closely as they used to be, especially out here in the middle of nowhere." He was probably right. Olympics backcountry was notorious for communication dead zones, and emergency monitoring was spotty at best. Even if someone had heard my transmission, it would take hours to organize a response and locate my position. I didn't have hours. "You know what I find interesting about you, Kira?" Reeves said, adjusting his position in the tree to get a better angle. "You're everything I used to be. Dedicated, by the book, convinced that training and procedure can overcome any obstacle. I was like that once, before I learned the truth." "What truth?" "That the wilderness doesn't care about your regulations. That sometimes the only law that matters is survival of the fittest. That predators and prey exist in perfect balance, and pretending otherwise is just civilization's greatest lie. Below me, I could see Blackwood moving closer to the tower's base. They were coordinating their attack, preparing for the final phase of their hunt. Once Reeves had me pinned from above, Blackwood could climb the ladder unopposed. I had maybe minutes before this ended badly. The platform's railing was more decorative than functional, but it was made of metal rather than wood. If I could work one of the support posts loose, it might serve as a weapon. I began working at the bolts with my multi-tool, trying to stay low enough to avoid giving Reeves a clear shot. The first one was accidental, he continued, his voice taking on a confessional tone. A poacher who shot at me during a routine enforcement stop. I killed him in self-defense, but then I had to dispose of the body. You know how I felt afterward? The first bolt came free, corroded enough that it crumbled in my fingers. Alive. More alive than I'd felt in 20 years of wearing this uniform. The hunt, the kill, the absolute clarity of life and death decision-making. It was intoxicating. I realized I'd been wasting my life protecting people who didn't deserve protection from threats that weren't worth fighting. The second bolt was more stubborn, but the metal post was starting to wiggle in its mounting. I worked faster, aware that my movements were becoming more visible. That's when I understood my true calling. Not protection, but predation. Not serving the weak, but culling them. Darwin in action, red in tooth and claw. The post came free with a screech of metal on metal. It was about 3 feet long, solid steel, with enough weight to serve as a club or spear. Not much against a rifle, but better than nothing. Touching speech, I called up to him. But you're still just a washed-up ranger who couldn't handle being held accountable for his actions. The shot came immediately, as I'd hoped it would. The bullet sparked off the platform's metal floor inches from my head, but Reeves's anger had made him hasty. I rolled to my left and came up behind the radio housing, using the metal box for cover. Psychological manipulation, he said, but his voice was tighter now. Textbook stuff, try to make the subject angry so he makes mistakes. I wrote those textbooks, Kira. Did you write the one about disgraced employees who go postal? Because that's what this looks like from here. Another shot, this one punching through the radio housing but missing me entirely. He was definitely rattled now, letting emotion override his tactical training, but I was also running out of cover and Blackwood was almost at the ladder. Time for desperate measures. I gripped the metal post like a spear and waited for the next muzzle flash. When it came, I marked Reeves's position and hurled the makeshift weapon with everything I had. The post arced through the darkness like a javelin, and I heard a satisfying crash of breaking branches followed by a very human cry of pain. But I'd also exposed myself completely, and Blackwood was already climbing. I drew my sidearm and aimed down at the ladder, waiting for a clear shot. But he was using the tower's support beams for cover, ascending in quick bursts that made him a difficult target. By the time I had a clean line of sight, he was already close enough to grab my ankle. I kicked at his reaching hand and nearly lost my balance on the platform's edge. He lunged upward, trying to tackle me off the platform entirely, and we grappled at the ladder's top for several terrifying seconds. His grip was iron strong and he outweighed me by at least 50 pounds. But desperation gave me speed. I drove my knee into his solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought the butt of my pistol down on the back of his neck. He released his grip and tumbled backward off the ladder, hitting the platform once before crashing to the forest floor 40 feet below. The impact was sickeningly final. I looked down and saw his body twisted at impossible angles among the fallen leaves, dark stains spreading beneath him in the moonlight. "Well done," Reeves called from his tree, and I realized he was no longer in the same position. The metal post had struck him, but not fatally. He'd climbed higher, seeking a new vantage point. Though I should mention that wasn't really Blackwood. My blood turned to ice. What? Another hiker who got too curious about my activities. I've been using him as bait for months, promising him freedom if he helped me catch bigger prey. Poor bastard actually believed he might survive this. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. How many people had Reeves killed or manipulated? How many missing person cases across the Pacific Northwest could be laid at his feet? "You're insane," I said. I'm evolved. But don't worry. Your part in this is almost over. I've learned what I needed to know about your capabilities, your tactics, your limitations. The hunt has served its purpose. I heard the distinctive sound of a rifle bolt being worked, saw the faint gleam of a scope lens catching moonlight. He had me dead to rights from his elevated position, and we both knew it. That's when the helicopter appeared. It came in low and fast from the south, searchlight blazing, rotors thundering through the forest, quiet like the voice of some mechanical god. The beam swept across the grove, illuminating the tower, the body below, and most importantly, the man with a rifle perched in the cedar. Olympic base to any ranger in the field, the radio operator's voice boomed from the aircraft's external speakers. We have your emergency transmission. Are you secure? I waved frantically at the helicopter, shouting even though they couldn't hear me over the rotor noise. But my movement caught the searchlight's attention, and the beam fixed on the platform like a star falling to earth. Reeves fired once at the aircraft, his shot sparking off the fuselage without penetrating. But that muzzle flash gave away his position completely, and I heard the helicopter's crew reporting coordinates to ground teams already en route. "This isn't over," he shouted up at me, but his voice was already fading as he began his descent. Within seconds, he'd vanished into the forest like the ghost he'd always been. The helicopter circled the grove twice before finding a clearing large enough to attempt a landing. I climbed down the ladder on shaking legs, my hands cramping from the adrenaline that had sustained me through the last hours. By the time I reached the ground, I could hear the distant sound of ATVs approaching through the forest, the cavalry arriving at last. Martinez was in the first vehicle to reach the grove, his face grim as he took in the scene. The body at the base of the tower, the bullet holes in the radio housing, my torn uniform, and obvious exhaustion. "Thornfield," he said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before, respect maybe, or recognition. "Report." I told him everything, from the fake missing person case to the final confrontation in the tower. He listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification, but mostly just letting me talk until the words ran out. "Dalton Reeves," he said when I finished. "We've been tracking disappearances that might be connected to him for the last year. Your radio transmission was the first direct confirmation that he's still alive and active. He got away. For now. But you gave us more intelligence about his methods and location than we've had since he disappeared. That's something." The something felt hollow as they loaded the body into a rescue litter and began processing the crime scene. Another person dead because I'd walked into a trap like a rookie, because I'd ignored protocol and pursued a suspect alone. The fact that I'd survived didn't change the reality that my inexperience had cost someone their life. But Martinez seemed to read my thoughts. "The man who died wasn't killed because you made mistakes," he said quietly. "He was killed because a monster decided to use him as bait. Don't confuse cause and effect." The helicopter ride back to civilization took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. I stared out at the endless canopy of trees below, knowing that somewhere in that green darkness Dalton Reeves was still moving, still hunting, still turning the wilderness I'd sworn to protect into his personal killing ground. They found his camp 3 days later, a sophisticated base of operations hidden in a cave system that showed evidence of long-term occupation. Maps of regional parks with missing person cases marked in red. Surveillance equipment that could intercept ranger radio transmissions. Trophies taken from victims over the past 2 years. But Reeves himself had vanished completely, leaving behind only the certainty that he would surface again when the urge to hunt became stronger than the need to hide. I returned to duty 2 weeks later, after medical clearance and a psychological evaluation that deemed me fit for service. But something fundamental had changed during those hours in the forest. The wilderness I'd once seen as a sanctuary now held shadows that moved independently, sounds that carried threats instead of wonder. My first day back, I was assigned to desk duty, radio dispatch, filing reports, anything that kept me safely inside the visitor center. Martinez said it was temporary just until I found my confidence again. But we both knew better. I'd learned the same lesson that had driven Dalton Reeves over the edge, though I'd drawn the opposite conclusion. That the most dangerous predator in any wilderness is always human, and that all our training, all our procedures, All our civilization is just a thin veneer over something much older and darker. The difference was that I still believed the veneer mattered. That night, alone in my cabin, I wrote my incident report with hands that still shook when I thought too hard about what had happened. Official language, clinical descriptions, the kind of bureaucratic prose that turns horror into statistics. But I also wrote something else, a personal account of every detail I could remember, every word Reeves had spoken, every tactical decision that had kept me alive when others had died. Insurance in case he surfaced again. Evidence in case someone needed to understand how a ranger could become a monster. Because somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, Dalton Reeves was still hunting, still turning national parks into his personal game preserve, still proving that the most terrifying thing about the forest isn't what lives in it naturally, but what humans can become when they decide to stop pretending they're civilized. And someday, another rookie ranger would get a call about a missing person, would follow the protocols, trust their training, walk confidently into the woods believing that badge and uniform made them predator instead of prey. When that day came, I wanted them to know what was waiting in the darkness between the trees. I wanted them to know about the hunt,